I bet you didn't know the extent of Arab leaders' meetings with Nazi Germany during World War II, or how these encounters continue to fuel one of the most controversial debates of our time. Special thanks to Hacham Ya'ar ben-Emmett of the Torah Watchman Show International for his contributions to this investigation. One of the most persistent and fiercely contested claims from the era of the Second World War concerns the meeting between Adolf Hitler and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Hussayni. The assertion, which has found its way into political discourse and public debate, is that the Mufti persuaded a hesitant Hitler to annihilate the Jews of Europe, effectively planting the seed of the Holocaust. This idea suggests that without the Mufti's intervention, the Nazi regime might have pursued a policy of expulsion rather than extermination, a notion that fundamentally alters the timeline and moral responsibility for the greatest crime of the 20th century. This claim is not merely an academic footnote. It carries profound implications for how we understand the origins of the Holocaust and perceive the historical relationship between the Arab world and Nazi Germany. It touches upon sensitive issues of guilt, responsibility, and the historical drivers of anti-Semitism. When political leaders invoke this narrative, it reignites a firestorm of controversy, forcing historians, governments, and the public to re-examine the evidence. The debate compels us to ask difficult questions. Who was truly responsible for the decision to implement the final solution? Was it a singular event, a decision made in a single room? Or was it the culmination of a long and terrifying process? The truth matters not to absolve anyone of their documented crimes, but to ensure that history is recounted with accuracy and integrity. To unravel this complex issue, one must become a detective of the past, sifting through layers of propaganda, post-war testimony, and official records. The process requires a careful, methodical approach, one that separates documented facts from hearsay and political maneuvering. It is a journey back in time, not just to the fateful meeting in Berlin in November 1941, but to the years preceding it when the Nazi ideology of hate was methodically put into practice. Understanding the evolution of Nazi anti-Jewish policy is crucial to placing the Hitler-Mufti meeting in its proper context. We must look at what the Nazis were already doing to the Jews of Europe long before al-Hussayni arrived in the German capital, seeking an alliance against a common enemy. This essay will embark on that journey, guided by the consensus of mainstream historical scholarship. We will explore the timeline of the Holocaust, clarifying when the mass murder began and what key events like the Wannsee Conference truly signified. We will analyze the primary source documents from the Hitler-Mufti meeting itself to see what was actually said and proposed. Furthermore, we will examine the Mufti's undeniable and reprehensible collaboration with the Nazi regime, detailing his activities in propaganda and recruitment. By laying out the evidence piece by piece, we can unveil the truth of this matter, distinguishing between the Mufti's role as a Nazi collaborator and the unfounded claim that he was an architect of the Holocaust, thereby affirming where the ultimate responsibility for the genocide truly lies. Adolf Hitler's obsessive hatred of Jews was not a late development in his political career. It was the very foundation of his worldview, a cornerstone of his ideology from his earliest days in politics. As far back as 1919, in his first major political writing, Hitler called for the total removal of the Jews. This was not a vague sentiment, but a core objective that would guide his actions and the policies of the Nazi Party for the next quarter century. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, they did not immediately begin a campaign of mass murder, but they did initiate a systematic and escalating program of persecution designed to isolate, impoverish, and ultimately drive Jews out of Germany. This was a war waged in stages, a methodical tightening of the noose. The first years of Nazi rule were marked by a torrent of anti-Jewish legislation. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship and forbade marriage or relationships between Jews and non-Jews, legally defining them as a separate and inferior race. Economic policies pushed Jews out of their professions, seized their businesses, and confiscated their wealth. Synagogues were desecrated, and public spaces became segregated. The goal was to make life so unbearable that Jews would have no choice but to emigrate. This policy of forced expulsion was pursued with brutal efficiency. The state-sponsored pogrom of November 1938, known as Kristallnacht or the Night of Broken Glass, was a clear signal that violence would be an integral part of the Nazi solution to their self-created Jewish question. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 dramatically radicalized Nazi policy. As Germany conquered Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, millions of Jews fell under its direct control, far more than could ever be forced to emigrate. The Nazis herded these Jewish populations into overcrowded, sealed-off ghettos, where starvation, disease, and brutal forced labor led to mass death on an unprecedented scale. This ghettoization was an interim step, a holding pen, while the Nazi leadership contemplated a more final solution. The idea of shipping Europe's Jews to the island of Madagascar was briefly considered but ultimately abandoned as impractical. The war had created a new reality, and with it a new and far more horrific possibility began to take shape in the minds of the Nazi elite. The true turning point, the moment when the policy of persecution morphed into a program of systematic genocide, came with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. This event, which occurred a full 5 months before the Mufti met with Hitler, unleashed a new level of savagery. Following the German army were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads composed of SS and police personnel. Their explicit mission was to eliminate any perceived opposition, which in the Nazi worldview meant first and foremost the Jews. They were tasked with rounding up Jewish men, women, and children in captured Soviet territories and murdering them in mass shootings. This was the beginning of the Holocaust as a systematic, state-organized program of annihilation. By the time Hajj Amin al-Hussayni walked into the Reich Chancellery on November 28, 1941, the machinery of the Holocaust was not just designed. It was fully operational and had been running for months. The massacres perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front were not isolated incidents, but part of a coordinated campaign of murder. In places like Babi Yar outside Kiev, tens of thousands of Jews were shot and dumped into ravines in a matter of days. By the end of 1941, these killing squads had murdered an estimated 500,000 to 800,000 Jewish men, women, and children. This was not expulsion or resettlement. This was cold-blooded, systematic extermination carried out under direct orders from the highest levels of the Nazi regime, including Heinrich Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich. The decision to proceed with a Europe-wide genocide had already been formalized within the Nazi hierarchy. On July 31, 1941, 4 months before the Mufti's visit, Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, sent a now infamous directive to Reinhard Heydrich. He authorized Heydrich to make all necessary preparations for a comprehensive solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. This directive was the bureaucratic green light for what would become known as the final solution. It empowered Heydrich to coordinate with all relevant government agencies to organize the logistics of a continent-wide genocide. The plan was no longer theoretical, it was official policy, and the wheels were already in motion. Further evidence that the decision to annihilate the Jews predated the Mufti's meeting can be found in the physical construction of the death camps themselves. The planning and building of facilities designed specifically for mass murder began in the autumn of 1941. Construction of the Chełmno extermination camp in occupied Poland started in October 1941, and it became operational on December 8, 1941, just 10 days after the Hitler Mufti meeting. At Chełmno, victims were murdered in specially designed gas vans. Simultaneously, construction was beginning at the Belzec camp, another site built for the sole purpose of extermination. These camps were not built on a whim. They were the product of prior planning and a clear genocidal intent that was well established before al-Hussayni arrived in Berlin. Therefore, the historical record is unequivocally clear. The Holocaust was not an idea waiting for a catalyst in late November 1941. It was a brutal reality that had been unleashed across Eastern Europe. The decision had been made, the orders had been given, and the infrastructure of death was being built. The Nazi regime's war against the Jews, as Hitler himself would call it in his meeting with the Mufti, had already entered its most radical and murderous phase. The notion that Haj Amin al-Hussayni had to convince Hitler to embark on this path is a direct contradiction of the established, documented timeline of events. The train of genocide had already left the station and was gathering terrifying speed long before their conversation took place. On January 20th, 1942, nearly 2 months after the Hitler Mufti meeting, a group of 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gathered at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee in a suburb of Berlin. This meeting, the Wannsee Conference, has often been mistakenly portrayed as the moment the decision to commit the Holocaust was made. However, a close look at the historical context in the meeting's own documents reveals its true purpose. The conference was not a debate about whether to murder the Jews of Europe. That decision had already been made months earlier. Instead, it was a bureaucratic working session, a coordination meeting designed to ensure the smooth and efficient implementation of a policy already in progress. The conference was convened and chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the same man who had received the authorization from Göring back in July 1941 to prepare for a comprehensive solution. The invitation itself made the purpose clear, referencing Göring's directive as the basis for the meeting. The attendees were not the top-tier Nazi leaders like Hitler, Himmler, or Göring. They were state secretaries and senior representatives from various government ministries, the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry, the Interior Ministry, and the agencies responsible for the occupied territories. Their job was not to decide on policy, but to understand their respective roles in carrying it out. They were there to discuss the logistics of rounding up, transporting, and killing 11 million people. The minutes of the meeting, recorded by Adolf Eichmann, provide chilling evidence of its bureaucratic nature. There is no language of doubt or debate. The document speaks of evacuating Jews to the east, a euphemism for deporting them to death camps. It includes detailed charts listing the Jewish populations of every country in Europe, from Great Britain to the Soviet Union, all of whom were targeted for destruction. The conversation revolved around practical questions. How would they define who was a Jew? How would they deal with people of mixed parentage? How would they coordinate the complex railway schedules needed to transport millions of people across the continent to their deaths in Poland? The Wannsee Conference was about the how, not the if. In this context, the Wannsee Conference serves as another powerful piece of evidence demonstrating that the final solution was well underway before the end of 1941. The meeting was a consequence of the genocide, not its cause. It was an administrative checkpoint in a process that had begun with the mass shootings on the Eastern Front and the construction of the first death camps. The cold, businesslike tone of the conference minutes underscores the terrifying reality that, for the Nazi state, the Holocaust had become a large-scale administrative task. It had nothing to do with a plea or suggestion from a foreign dignitary like the Mufti. It was the horrifying logical endpoint of Nazi ideology put into practice by the German state bureaucracy. When Haj Amin al-Hussayni met Adolf Hitler, he came not as an equal or an influential advisor, but as a petitioner seeking support for his own political ambitions. The Mufti had fled the British Mandate of Palestine after inciting anti-British and anti-Jewish violence, and was now an exile looking for a powerful patron. His primary goal was to secure Germany's help in the Arab world's struggle for independence from British and French colonial rule. He also sought a public German declaration supporting the elimination of the Jewish national home in Palestine. The official German record of the meeting, which provides the most reliable account of the conversation, paints a clear picture of the dynamic between the two men. It was a meeting of a world leader and a regional figure seeking favor. According to the German summary, the Mufti began by expressing the Arab world's admiration for Germany and its Führer, emphasizing their shared enemies, the English, the Jews, and the Communists. He proposed a broad Arab revolt against the British, contingent on German military and financial support, and, crucially, a public declaration of support for Arab independence. Hitler listened to the Mufti's proposals, but ultimately denied his key requests. The Führer explained that the timing was not right for such a declaration. German armies were still fighting deep in the Soviet Union, and he did not want to provoke the British or the French in the Middle East prematurely. He told the Mufti to wait, promising that Germany's support would come once German forces reached the Southern Caucasus. The conversation then turned to the so-called Jewish question. It was Hitler, not the Mufti, who dominated this part of the discussion. He reaffirmed to his guests that Germany was engaged in an uncompromising war against the Jews. He explained his policy in global terms, stating that his goal was the destruction of the Jewish Communist Empire in Europe. Hitler explicitly stated that Germany was resolved step by step to ask one European nation after the other to solve its Jewish problem, and at the proper time to direct a similar appeal to non-European nations as well. This was not a leader being persuaded. This was a leader informing a visitor of a pre-existing, non-negotiable, and globally ambitious genocidal policy. The meeting's record contains no evidence that the Mufti suggested the idea of extermination to Hitler. He did not need to. Hitler's own words show that the plan was already in motion, and its scope was already planetary. The Mufti's role was to listen and to agree. The summary notes that the Mufti was gratified by Hitler's statements and left the meeting confident in Germany's ultimate support for his cause. He had received a promise for the future, but he had not influenced Nazi Germany's present course of action regarding the Jews of Europe. The record shows a man being briefed on a genocidal policy, not a man co-authoring it. The Mufti was a supplicant who was informed of a decision, not an instigator who proposed one. If the official records of the Hitler-Mufti meeting and the established timeline of the Holocaust show no evidence of the Mufti's influence, where did this powerful myth originate? The source of the claim is not a primary document, a diary, or a recording, but rather second-hand post-war testimony. The story comes from SS officer Dieter Wislitzny, an aide to Adolf Eichmann. After the war, during his interrogation before the Nuremberg trials, Wislitzny was quoted by two Jewish activists, Endre Steiner and Resso Kashner, as having told them during the war that the Mufti had played a role in convincing Hitler to exterminate the Jews rather than merely expel them. This single indirect account is the sole foundation upon which the entire claim rests. However, this testimony is fraught with problems that historians find insurmountable. First and foremost, it is hearsay. We do not have Wislitzny's direct sworn testimony stating this claim. We have the account of two other people recalling what he allegedly told them. More importantly, when Wislitzny himself gave a detailed formal affidavit to Nuremberg prosecutors in 1946, he described his interaction with the Mufti, but made no mention whatsoever of this supposed crucial role in the final solution. If the Mufti's influence was as decisive as the story suggests, it is highly likely that Wislitzny, who was trying to cooperate with prosecutors to save his own life, would have included such a significant piece of information in his official statement. Its absence is telling. Furthermore, historians widely recognize that Nazi officials, particularly those in the SS, frequently lied to their Jewish interlocutors during the war. Men like Wislitzny and Eichmann often used deception and misinformation as tools to manipulate Jewish leaders, to sow confusion, or to shift blame. It is entirely plausible that Wislitzny told this story to Kashner and Steiner for his own purposes, perhaps to deflect responsibility away from the SS or to exaggerate the influence of an external actor. Relying on the uncorroborated second-hand account of a known war criminal who was part of the very apparatus of genocide is an incredibly flimsy basis for rewriting the history of the Holocaust's origins. Historical scholarship demands a higher standard of evidence. Therefore, the scholarly consensus is that the Wislitzny story is not credible evidence. It stands in stark contrast to the mountain of primary source documents, from Göring's directive to the Wannsee Conference minutes to the official record of the Hitler-Mufti meeting itself, all of which point to the Holocaust being an internally driven Nazi German project. The myth of the Mufti's decisive influence persists not because of historical evidence, but because it serves certain political narratives. It offers a convenient way to shift a portion of the blame for a uniquely German crime and to draw a direct line from Arab nationalism to Nazi genocide. But the facts simply do not support the assertion. To debunk The myth that Hajj Amin al-Hussayni was an architect of the Holocaust is not to absolve him of his crimes. The historical record is abundantly clear that the Mufti was a committed, enthusiastic, and ideologically aligned collaborator with Nazi Germany. His partnership with the Nazis was not one of convenience, but one of conviction. He was driven by his own political goals, primarily the establishment of an independent Arab state and the prevention of a Jewish state in Palestine, but he also shared Nazism's virulent anti-Semitism. He saw in Nazi Germany a powerful ally that could help him achieve his aims and destroy their common Jewish enemy. His collaboration was extensive and had deadly consequences. The Mufti's alliance with the Axis powers began even before he arrived in Berlin. After fleeing Palestine, he found refuge in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, where he was welcomed as a valuable asset. The Nazis provided him with a lavish lifestyle, a staff, and access to the highest levels of the regime, including meetings with Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Eichmann. In return, the Mufti became one of the most prominent non-German voices in the Nazi propaganda machine. He was given a platform to broadcast his hateful messages across the Arab and Muslim world, blending Nazi-style anti-Semitic tropes with his own extremist interpretations of Islamic texts to incite hatred against Jews, the British, and the Allied powers. His commitment to the Nazi cause was unwavering. He remained loyal to Hitler until the very end, even as the Third Reich crumbled in 1945. His personal papers and the records of his German hosts reveal a man who was not a reluctant partner, but an active participant. He saw the world through a similar conspiratorial lens as the Nazis, believing in a global Jewish plot that had to be defeated, while his primary focus was the conflict in Palestine. His rhetoric and actions aligned seamlessly with Germany's broader genocidal war. He understood what the final solution meant and did everything in his power to support the regime that was carrying it out. It is this real, documented collaboration that must be the focus of any historical assessment of the Mufti. He was not a decision maker in Berlin, but he was a key partner in the Nazis' global political and ideological war. He provided them with legitimacy in parts of the Muslim world, assisted in their military efforts, and worked actively to ensure that Jews who might have escaped the Holocaust would have nowhere to go. His actions were those of a man who knew a genocide was taking place and supported its perpetrators. This truth is damning enough on its own. It does not need to be embellished with myths that distort the historical origins of the Holocaust itself. The Mufti's most significant contribution to the Nazi war effort was in the realms of propaganda and military recruitment. From his base in Berlin, he directed a relentless campaign of radio broadcasts aimed at the Middle East and North Africa. Using powerful shortwave transmitters, his message reached millions. In these broadcasts, he urged his listeners to rise up against the British and to support the Axis powers. He framed the war as a holy struggle and repeatedly demonized Jews, using language borrowed directly from Nazi propaganda. He spoke of world Jewry as an evil force and called for its destruction, echoing the genocidal rhetoric of his German hosts and helping to spread Nazi ideology far beyond the borders of Europe. Beyond propaganda, the Mufti took an active role in recruiting Muslims to fight for the Nazi regime. He was particularly instrumental in the formation of the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS, also known as the Handschar Division, which was composed primarily of Bosnian Muslims. The Mufti traveled to the Balkans using his religious authority to encourage enlistment. He portrayed service in the SS as a righteous cause, a way to fight against both communist partisans and their supposed Jewish puppet masters. While the division was primarily used in anti-partisan operations, it also played a role in securing railway lines that were used to deport Hungarian Jews to their deaths at Auschwitz, directly implicating the unit in the machinery of the Holocaust. Perhaps most despicably, Hajj Amin al-Hussayni actively worked to obstruct efforts to rescue Jews from the Holocaust. He was terrified by the prospect that Jewish refugees from Europe, particularly children, might be allowed to emigrate to Palestine. He repeatedly and personally intervened with German, Italian, and other Axis-aligned governments to block any such rescue attempts. In 1943, he protested plans to allow several thousand Jewish children to escape from Bulgaria and Romania, insisting to the German Foreign Ministry that they be sent to Poland instead. He knew full well that sending Jews to Poland at that time was a death sentence. His actions directly condemned thousands of people, including children, to their deaths in the gas chambers. These activities, propaganda, recruitment, and the obstruction of rescue efforts constitute the Mufti's true and terrible legacy. He was not a mastermind of the final solution, but he was a zealous accomplice. He lent his voice and his authority to the Nazi cause. He helped recruit soldiers to fight for the SS, and he used his influence to close off escape routes for the victims of the genocide. He was fully aware of the mass murder of Jews and did everything he could to support the perpetrators and ensure their genocidal work was completed. His culpability lies in these documented actions, which are more than sufficient to condemn him as a war criminal and an enabler of genocide. The historical evidence leads to an unambiguous conclusion. The Holocaust was conceived, planned, and executed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime of Germany. The decision to transition from persecution and expulsion to systematic extermination was an internal one, born of a deeply rooted racist ideology and radicalized by the circumstances of the Second World War. The final solution was already in motion months before Hajj Amin al-Hussayni met with Hitler in November 1941. At the time of their meeting, hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been murdered by mobile killing squads on the Eastern Front, and the first death camps were under construction. The genocide was a German project, and the responsibility for it is Germany's alone. The claim that the Mufti convinced Hitler to commit the Holocaust is a myth unsupported by the historical record. It relies on flimsy second-hand testimony that is contradicted by a wealth of primary source documents. The official German summary of the Hitler Mufti meeting shows a supplicant seeking aid, not an advisor shaping policy. Hitler's own words in that meeting confirm that his genocidal plan was already established and global in scope. The Wannsee Conference further solidifies this timeline, showing that it was a meeting to coordinate the logistics of an ongoing genocide, not to decide upon one. To suggest the Mufti was the instigator is to distort the past and to misunderstand the very nature of the Nazi regime and its fanatical war against the Jews. This does not, however, mean that the Mufti was an innocent bystander. He was a dedicated and enthusiastic collaborator with the Nazis, a man whose actions were morally reprehensible and had lethal consequences. He was a powerful and hateful propagandist, a recruiter for the SS, and a man who actively worked to block the rescue of Jews, including children, from the clutches of the death camps. He was an accessory to genocide, and his legacy is one of hatred and complicity. His guilt is profound and well documented, but his crimes were those of an accomplice, not an architect. He joined a genocidal enterprise that was already in full swing. He did not create it. Ultimately, historical accuracy is paramount. It is crucial for remembering the victims, for educating future generations, and for understanding how such an atrocity could happen. Placing the responsibility for the Holocaust squarely on Nazi Germany is not about absolving collaborators like the Mufti. It is about acknowledging the truth. The Holocaust was the monstrous culmination of a specific ideology and a specific regime. By focusing on the documented facts, we honor the memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered and ensure that the lessons of this dark chapter in human history are never forgotten or distorted for political convenience. The truth is clear. The Holocaust was Hitler's decision, and the blame is his.
If you've enjoyed this program, please click like and subscribe.